Hello, everybody. Welcome back and welcome to our next talk. Our next speaker is Brian Martinez, who will be speaking on can you steal an election? It's a good question. And with that, Brian, I leave it to you.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everyone, for having me here, and thank you for watching, whether it's live or later on here. Of course, as Kyle said, my name is Brian Martinez, and this is Can You Steal an Election? Real quick, we're just gonna try to run through this because there's so much to talk about. So who am I? Again, I'm Brian. I've got my own little small company I just started, Bide Consulting or Bide Security. You can email me at brian@bidesec. You can find me on Twitter. I tweet pretty occasionally, bmart517. Obviously, I work in security. I do governance, risk, and compliance, and I found that this topic was very relatable to what I do. There's a number of things, laws, policies, procedures that a number of people have to follow in order to pull off an election, and so I just found this topic very interesting. I originally set out to be a journalist, not someone who works in IT or works in security. I mentioned this because it was kind of that curiosity that led me to research this topic. Having conversations with my next door neighbor about politics. He's very concerned about the election, and of course I am too, for different reasons. It left me with a lot of questions, and it set me on the path of reaching out to people and asking even more questions, and doing a lot of reading and doing a lot of research, watching a lot of YouTube videos and webinars leading into this election. I like talking to people. That's why I'm here. Hopefully we can have a conversation. I don't know if we're gonna have time for a lot of questions afterwards, but I'd like to be able to take some questions. If we don't, feel free again, please to reach out to me on Twitter. Email me. You can find me on the MySec Slack. You can find me on LinkedIn. Wherever else. Discord. Of course, we're on Discord too. I am not at all an election expert. Maybe I'm a little more of an expert than you are. That's kind of why I'm here. I learned a lot in the last, really, this project started for me about 3 months ago. I have probably spent easily 40 hours reading up on election security, all of the topics that are related to an election. Easily 40 hours. I'd say probably well north of that, maybe even more than 60. So I know a fair amount, enough to get my foot in the door here to present to you today, but this isn't what I do for a living, right? Those are the kinds of people I was talking to. A little more personal about me. Of course, I'm a father of 2 kids. I've got 2 awesome boys. They are best friends and worst enemies. It's really great. It's very interesting during this pandemic. I'm a husband. I have a very amazing, supportive wife. She and I have been together for, let's see here, 24 years, I think, if I'm doing my math correctly. We've not been married for 24 years, but we've been together for that long. Of course, I'm a U.S. citizen. That's where we're at. And I am a Michigander. Yes, the feeling is forever. For anyone who's old enough to remember those campaign commercials promoting our state. I'm not going to read through all this, but we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. And to be honest with you, this is only just scratching the surface. Since the way I kind of pitch this to you all, as you see on the speaker schedule, I pitch this as you're running for election and you really want to win. And, what can you do to help you win? The 2 biggest tools in our shed that we're going to talk about are disenfranchisement and disinformation. There's a few other things like intimidation, and of course the things that we are not going to be talking about. As you can see below there's a giant list. Again, I could name even more things that would help bend an election to your favor and maybe even help you quote steal an election. So we're not going to talk about those things, but if you're interested in this topic, those are other things that you can start to look into. Or we can have a conversation about that later on, about some of those things. The other thing we're going to talk about is the people, processes, and procedures and technology. I'm sorry, related to electoral fraud, vote rigging, voter fraud, and we're going to go through all of these here rather briefly because this is towards the end of the presentation. Okay, but wait, there's more. Once again, I am not an election expert. There's some questions that you might have of me. I'm happy to entertain them, and I might try to answer them as best as I can, but there's going to be a number of things that I really just don't know. Again, I've only been doing this for reading up on this and learning about this for the last 2-3 months. And while I have a number of hours in, and I've read a lot of research papers, I don't consider myself, the go-to person for this, and I probably would point you to someone else. Okay. So that's enough about me. Let's talk about you and your campaign. And also, what do you think of me? I'm just kidding. Let's not go there right now. You can give me feedback later on. All right. We're going to talk about your candidacy. This is your candidacy. Well, hopefully not. This is actually Vermin Supreme, who was running for office a while ago, and here he is glitter bombing another fellow politician. But let's learn a little bit more about you and your attempt to run for office here. All right, first up, you're politically savvy, right? You know how to play the game. You know the people you got to talk to. You know the things you got to say. You know where to make the right connections. You feel confident in yourself. You're well-spoken and you're persuasive. That's probably one of the reasons why people suggested to you that you run for office. Like, hey, yeah, you're making a lot of sense. I like what you got to say. You should consider running for office. You probably know people, but if you don't know people, you know people who know people, right? So, maybe you know someone who's already a politician, or maybe you know someone who's a journalist who can help get a story out there about you. But maybe you don't. It's likely that maybe you don't know someone who writes the political beat at the newspaper, but maybe you know someone who's a sports writer, and that sports writer can help make the connection, and maybe even help that political journalist write something positive about you. If you guys met up for steak and a beer or something like that sometime, not during a pandemic. You have a solid team behind you. It probably starts off with just a couple of people. But as your candidacy gets more serious, and I guess depending on the level of the office that you're running for, you start building out a much more solid team. The people there, they believe in you, they like your message, they're going to repeat the things that you say, and they know what they're doing in the roles that you've assigned them to. You stay on message. Flip-flopping throughout your life is something that happens to everybody, right? But flip-flopping while you're on the campaign, oof, that's not something you want to do. So you crafted a message ahead of time. You have people that are helping you also craft that message in real time, maybe as new topics come up. But you stay on that message. You don't veer away from it. And good or bad, people don't stop talking about you. That works very well to your favor. Even people that say bad things about you sometimes think positively of you. They think like, he makes some good points, but I just don't like the way he says it. So that's something else that's going on for you. And you don't wear an actual boot on your head. I mean, maybe you do, but I wouldn't recommend it. I don't think people will take you terribly seriously if that's what you do. Also, you're not going to wear a Santa hat on your head either. You're just going to look like a normal person. All right. So I realized, so I asked some questions here and I was hoping to get some feedback in real time, but I'm realizing the way I have my screen set up, I can't see things too well. So I will just ask, what color is this pop? And by the way, it is definitely pop. We're here in Michigan. It's pop. It's not soda. I found this graphic by using the term soda, but this is definitely pop. So what color is this pop? Feel free to, if you're live on YouTube right now, feel free to share what color you see this pop as. Say it on Slack, Twitter, whatever. Just feel free to interact in some way. I unfortunately probably won't get back to it until later on. But go ahead. What color is this pop? Okay. And we're going to come back to that. This has significance. So now we're going to talk about our first big tool in our tool set that's going to help us bend this election to our favor. And that's disenfranchisement. So first up, let me know that disenfranchisement is often used interchangeably with the phrase voter suppression. And in fact, it might be more fair to say that voter suppression is the greatest tool you have working for you. And it's also an act of disenfranchisement. Hopefully this makes a little more sense when I say that what we're talking about when we say disenfranchisement is the act of depriving a person of rights or privileges of full participation in any community or organization, especially of the opportunity to influence policy or make one's voice heard. Historically, of course, this is deeply entrenched in our history of slavery and racism in this country. And of course, it has greatly impacted women and other minorities too, particularly Native Americans. We'll dive We'll dive a bit deeper into this as we talk about the history of disenfranchisement. Nowadays, though, I would say arguably it's a little more classist than racist, but it still has insidious roots in racism, right? There's a large number of the minority population in the United States that lives at or below the poverty line. But of course, there's also a large number of the white population, the majority population, that lives at or below the poverty line. Unfortunately, I didn't gather stats before I put this together, but I seem to remember it's somewhere between like 40 and 60% of the country is living at that level, right? And maybe they're doing okay or well enough because they're working 2 jobs or maybe even 3 jobs, but that's not something that they should have to do. But that is also a conversation for another time. So here's some brief examples. The nonprofit group. So while I was researching this, I found this nonprofit group called the Voting Rights Alliance, and they actually put together a PDF that's titled 61 Forms of Voter Suppression. 61. That's huge, right? So obviously we're not going to go through all 61 of them. I have a few of them listed here, and I got a couple more I want to mention. You've got the strict photo ID laws, which means you must have a government issued photo ID, whether that's a driver's license or a passport. Of course, it's something that's probably going to cost you money. It's definitely going to cost you time to go get if you don't already have one. We have the closing of polling places. I've seen this a lot where some counties or cities had a great number of polling places and they closed all of them down but one. You have ex-felon laws, and this varies state by state, but there are some states that say, hey, you've served your time, you were a felon, you were in jail, you served your time, you got all your rights back. There are other states that say, no, you were a felon, you don't get to vote, like you messed up. That's a form of voter suppression. Long lines. On the surface, I think people think of long lines as actually something great, right? Like, hey, a lot of people are here to vote. That's awesome. People are really engaged. They want their voice heard. But if you kind of step back and think about it, in a healthy democracy and in a well-managed election, this wouldn't be the case at all, right? There would be minimal lines because people would have the opportunity to vote ahead of time, whether via absentee ballot or even in person at the clerk's office. And there would be enough time for that to happen, right? Like it wouldn't just be election day as one day on a business day and you're working an hourly job and you have to determine whether or not you're going to be unpaid for an hour or 2 or 5 or 6. That's actually not a good sign, long lines. So that's kind of a form of voter suppression. And then, of course, we got gerrymandering here. That is a topic in and of itself. That's seriously a whole other presentation. And I had to draw the line somewhere. I've seen things about gerrymandering. It's deep. So we're not going to dive into that at all today. Another form that you might think about is not being accessible to those with disabilities. If the building doesn't have proper accommodations, people with in wheelchairs or maybe there's not ballots for the blind, there's going to be troubles there, right? And that's a form of voter suppression. So now we're getting into the part where this is maybe a little more journalism for me. I think it's worthwhile to look back at the history of disenfranchisement throughout this country. This topic is also deep, and I tried to grab what I thought were some of the key highlights throughout our nation's history of disenfranchisement and suppression. This is, I'll be honest with you, this is probably going to be the longest part. When I was younger, I was not really a big fan of history or social studies, I guess we call it back in school, particularly older history. But I think I've learned as I've gotten older, if it's a topic that I'm very interested in, I really like to dive into this. So I found this is all like, I'm like, I know this stuff, but it's not stuff that I really retained, and kind of relearning it again was fascinating to me. So going back to the founding of our country, 1776, when we declared independence from England, the state of New Jersey decided that those folks with enough wealth, they could exercise their right to vote. And this meant you could be a woman and you could vote. This meant you could be a free black man and you could vote. The women, they had their wealth that was inherited from male figureheads in their families passing, whether that was their husbands or their fathers, or maybe in some cases, their brothers or children. But But yeah, there were free black men as well who owned property in New Jersey, and they voted too. Even non-citizens, interestingly, could vote in America back then. But you have to kind of remember there's only 13 colonies, and there's a whole area of unexplored land where people kind of came and go because that's what they did for years and years prior to 1776. So that went on for about 30 years. Then concerns about voter fraud started coming up. People were worried that men might cross-dress as women and go vote somewhere, so therefore, double voting. They were worried about ineligible women who didn't have wealth, coming in by the carriage full to come vote. Does that sound a little familiar this year, right? I think we heard about buses of illegals, as some politicians call them, buses of illegals coming and voting. So after 30 or so years of this, these privileges were stripped away from everyone across all the states. Some states a little more quickly than others. And then for the next 60 years or so, only white men with wealth could vote. Then, of course, the Civil War happened. That's, again, another topic we won't dive deep into, but the Civil War happened. And in January of 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed. And the 13th Amendment, if you recall, was the amendment that abolished slavery. It wasn't ratified until December of 1865. And it turns out that President Lincoln was assassinated in May of 1865. So it was really up to Andrew Johnson to see through what became known as Reconstruction. In March of 1867, I'm not advancing my slides here. In March of 1867, Congress, over the veto of President Johnson, which is actually the first time that our Congress ever continued on passing a law over a president's veto, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which then granted black men the right to vote. Women still couldn't vote, mind you, and Native Americans, of course, still couldn't vote. But again, we'll get to that shortly. So this led to the passage of the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons or persons born or naturalized in the United States. And then it also led to the 15th Amendment, which stated that voting rights could not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this enfranchised black male voters, and vote they did. During this period of time, during Reconstruction, we saw 22 black men elected into Congress. So while the 15th Amendment opened the door for the rights of black men to vote, it did still leave on the table the ability for states to determine individually specific qualifications for suffrage, right? So as you can probably guess, back then, black men getting elected into Congress, well, a lot of white folks were upset with that, and particularly in the South, given, we just had war over this, a civil war. So eventually, Florida became the first state to really simply put, criminalize blackness. And this is the beginnings of the era of Jim Crow laws. Many states already had laws preventing felons from voting. And well, if you can criminalize being black, then you can make it very easy to suppress the vote of black folks. And of course, when I say criminalize blackness, it's not just you're black and that's against the law. It's, oh, well, you cut in front of line, or you didn't wait, you use the white bathroom and not the black bathroom, right? Things like that. That's what criminalized blackness. They made it very easy to say, hey, black people, you can't do that. So in addition to that, numerous states decided they could determine whether or not you were qualified to vote based on how much money you had, right? And while this applied to everybody, this poll tax, it disproportionately affected black folks because, of course, they had just come out of slavery and were very unlikely to have much wealth or any money at all. And so we had the poll tax. As if that wasn't enough, we then had literacy tests. And, some of the tests were very purposefully long and difficult. But some of them even had obtuse questions with things such as, how high is up? Right? Like, how do you answer that? Like, what is the correct answer to how high is up? I don't know that there is one. That would be, I think, very subjective, and therefore you can deny someone's right to vote. So then in 1898, here we go. Sorry about the slides. I'm going through my notes here and forgetting to advance my slides. In 1898, 7 southern states passed what was known as the Grandfather Clause. for voting purposes. And what the grandfather clause did is it exempted you from being from owning property, it exempted you from poll taxes, and it exempted you from literacy tests if you enjoyed the right to vote prior to 1867, or if you didn't, your lineal descendants did enjoy that right. So since blacks weren't granted full adoption of the right to vote until 1870, with the adoption of the 15th Amendment, these clauses effectively worked to exclude blacks from voting and assured that many impoverished and illiterate whites could vote. I bet not all of you knew that the phrase grandfathered in actually had racist roots, did you? All right. So in 1915, the Supreme Court ruled that grandfather clauses were unconstitutional, but the literacy tests and poll taxes continued until 1964, which we'll get to momentarily. All right. There's still some more history we got to go through. Excuse me. In 1920, the 19th Amendment passed, which granted women the right to vote. In 1924, the Snyder Act passed, which granted Native Americans the right to vote. However, due to each state still being able to determine who had rights to vote in an election, it took another 40 years, right, going back to 1964, 1965, before all 50 states allowed Native Americans the right to vote. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was ratified. The 24th Amendment prohibited Congress or states from conditioning the right to vote on federal elections or on a payment of a poll tax or other types of tax. Also in 1964, we have the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and later sexual orientation. It also prohibited unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools and public accommodations, and employment discrimination. However, resistance to the Civil Rights Act by white officials, particularly in the South, was intractable. They made it difficult, right? So ultimately, non-compliance in the South led to what is known as, by some, as the Selma to Montgomery marches, of which there were 3. And to some, the third and final march ultimately culminated in what is sometimes referred to as Bloody Sunday, which is not to be confused with the Bloody Sunday from Ireland that U2 sang about. Again, different topic for a different time. The marches took place because blacks felt, not they felt, but blacks were still effectively denied their constitutionally granted right to vote. And so the late John Lewis, along with other black leaders and some white leaders too, along with 600 other people, they marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama, protesting for the right to vote. The governor in Alabama at the time was George Wallace, and he asked the police to do whatever they could to stop the protest, and whatever they could do, indeed, they did. The imagery of policemen brutally attacking peaceful protesters shocked the nation and President Lyndon Johnson into action, and not long after that, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. And it is considered the most effective piece of federal civil rights legislation ever enacted. For the next 43 years, people on both sides of the aisle happily amended it 5 times to expand its protections and to ensure that it kept being renewed and re-signed, all the way up to President George Bush Jr., who happily signed it. I remember watching him sitting there at the table, being quite glad to continue on the Voting Rights Act. You all still with me, I hope? We're about to wrap it up, and notably in a depressing fashion. So part of the Voting Rights Act required something of a number of southern states and an oddball county here and there in other states that's called preclearance. There's a couple of parts in the Voting Rights Act that spell out, hey, there's this formula that you got to follow that determine whether or not a state or a county needs to be beholden to preclearance. So what that means is before those states or counties could update their election laws, they have to basically get pre-clearance from the federal government. And of course, this is to ensure the ugly past of disenfranchisement could never happen again, right? But remember, each state can still set their own, they still get to make up their own mind about what their elections look like. So this is, it's just oversight. All right. So keep hanging with me. In 2008, the most diverse body of citizens in this country elected the first ever black president, Barack Obama. This Made a lot of people happy. A lot of people happy. This upset some other people too. People who had power. So fast forward to 2011, when Shelby County in Alabama sued the U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder at the time in U.S. District Court, saying sections 4B and 5 of the Voting Rights Act were unconstitutional, and they sought permanent injunction against their enforcement. So again, Section 4B spelled out the formula of who has to abide by the preclearance, and Section 5 spelled out, this is what the preclearance is and what it means. Well, the district court decided they upheld the government stance. So then, of course, it went to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and they affirmed the lower court. The Supreme Court then granted certiorari to Shelby County, and they agreed to hear about the decisions of the lower courts. And ultimately, they decided that, hey, you know what? The formula to determine this is no longer relevant, and yeah, it's unconstitutional to make state and local governments abide by these provisions in the Voting Rights Act. And like that, they gutted the Voting Rights Act. Once the act was gutted, about half the states of the nation, some of them very immediately, enacted new restrictions on how people voted. And that included, again, mass polling of closing stations, creating stricter ID laws, and purging up to 40% of their voter rolls. All of this in the name of voter fraud prevention, right? Which we'll get to later in this presentation. So it's difficult to say with any certainty how any individual one of these actions had an effect on any election in the years since. However, according to election lawyer Mark Elias, whose name is in the news lately, it turns out he's actually working for Joe Biden now. But when I wrote this, I guess I didn't know that he had been doing that. But he has this quote that I'd like to read. So, quote, "People are always looking for the one thing that causes voters not to vote. Voter suppression laws work in tandem with one another. Often these things come in pairs, or they come in groups of 3 or 4. And it is the cumulative effect of each of these individual provisions that has a suppressive effect on voting." All right, y'all still with me? I hope. What color is this pop? Again, if you didn't answer before, you're tuning in now. Go ahead and answer it. YouTube, Slack, Discord, Twitter, wherever. What color is this pop? We're going to come back to it. I promise. All right, let's tie all this together in a hypothetical now. So we began this talking about your campaign. So we're going to talk about me. These are hypothetical facts about me, a voter in your district or your state. I live in Edison County in Hooverville. I hold 2 jobs. I work first and second shift. Sometimes I work second and third shift. Sometimes I work all 3. But I hold 2 jobs. I'm trying to I'm struggling to make ends meet. It's paycheck to paycheck. Sometimes it's even worse than that, right? Like maybe I'm in the hole. I either rely on public transport or, in your hypothetical, if you want, maybe I have my own vehicle, but because I'm not well-to-do, my vehicle is unreliable, right? Excuse me. So I don't like to drive long distances because the likelihood of my vehicle breaking down somewhere is going to leave me with a towing fee. Then, of course, there's the repair fees. So I don't like to travel far. So I have an unreliable vehicle. Edison County, they just closed 200 polling stations throughout the whole county. There's only a handful left. I used to have one I could walk to go vote. But now I got to figure out where the next closest one is. And it might not be anywhere close. It might be 50 miles away. It might be elsewhere in the county. I don't know. I got to figure that out. I have a feeling that you as the candidate who maybe, or maybe you're an incumbent, maybe you might know where it is. And maybe that was on purpose. And then it turns out Hooverville purged me from their voter rolls. Hooverville, they had a public hearing that was not loudly announced saying, hey, we're going to purge voters from the voter rolls. If you're an eligible voter, you need to come in and defend yourself. Well, maybe I did know about it, but guess what? I'm working 2 jobs and I'm paid hourly. I can't just leave my job to go defend my right to vote. I got to, put food on the table for my family. So, if you think about these things, you can kind of see how all of this comes together for this mass, awful suppressive effect, right? Like when election day comes, am I going to go unpaid to go vote, or am I going to work my jobs to make sure I can feed my family? And therefore my voice isn't heard, right? That's disenfranchisement. And I forgot to add the last fact there. My state has strict voter ID laws, right? So then I also have to make that decision. Okay, I'm determined I want to vote, but you have purged me, and let's go back to the I rely on public transport. Let's say I don't have my own vehicle. Well, now I have to determine, not only did I get purged, now I have to determine, am I going to go to the clerk or the Secretary of State and get my voter ID? That's going to cost me money and time because I'm missing out on my job. And it's also going to cost me more money to actually get this ID, right? Do I want to invest the $20 or $50 or $120, whatever the cost might be to get this ID? So you can really see how all of these things are really unhealthy in a democracy that we want to hear people's voices. All right, moving on to our next tool, disinformation. This one's not as big, but this one is also very interesting. Before we move on, again, what color is this pop? This is Redpop. You don't think so? I'm telling you, it's Redpop. What if I put it over here? The colors line up a little better. This is Redpop, right? This is Redpop. I'm telling you, this is Redpop. This is Redpop. Okay, we'll get back to this again. I promise. So disinformation. What is it? Excuse me. Simply put, and from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it is false information deliberately and often covertly spread as by the planting of rumors in order to influence public opinion or obscure the truth. While I was doing a lot of research on this, another researcher I was reading up on from the University of Washington by the name of Professor Kate Starbird, she said this, at least with regards to disinformation on social media. She says, perhaps the most common misconception is that disinformation is simply false information. If it were, platforms could simply add true or false labels, a tactic that has often been suggested. But disinformation often layers true information with false, an accurate set in misleading context, a real photograph purposely mislabeled, right? That makes disinformation a really hard thing to combat. And not only that, disinformation is often referred to as fake news, which arguably is a different thing. Again, that's a conversation for another time, but it spreads 6 times faster on social media than regular news, right? and there's a reason why for that, and we'll get to it in a little bit here. All right. Reminder, this is Redpop. Okay. So who's targeted by disinformation? Well, really us, right? You, me, Democrats, Republicans, independents. It doesn't matter. Everybody is targeted by disinformation. People, particularly people looking for information about something that's newsworthy, right? It's all of us. We're all the target. No one is immune from disinformation. It doesn't matter whether you're a complete idiot or you're a genius. People are going to take advantage of that fact. Maybe they know the things you're searching, like you're going to be searching for things in the oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the publication. Columbia Journalism Review, something like that. A little higher minded publication, right? So when you're searching for things there, maybe not on the site, but searching through Google or somewhere else, people are going to try to inject disinformation, right? And get you to read there, right? They're going to try to elicit an emotional response from you and grab you. Okay. So we're all targeted by disinformation. Hey, reminder, this is Redpop. We got an arrow pointing at this time. I think that really drives it home. This is definitively Redpop. All right. What about misinformation or malinformation? So there's definitely a difference here. And besides the one letter between misinformation and disinformation, the difference is actually intent, right? So disinformation is intended to trip you up. It's malicious. Whereas misinformation is it's bad information, but not purposefully so. So, let's just imagine quickly, you heard from your friend that the party was at 8:00, but it turns out it was actually at 9:00. But you go around telling everybody, like, hey, are you coming to the party tonight? It starts at 8:00. I hope to see you there. 8:00, 8:00, 8:00. And it turns out it actually started at 9, right? So you're unintentionally spreading misinformation, but you didn't intend to deceive anybody. You just had the info wrong. That's misinformation. Malinformation, excuse me, I'm sorry. Malinformation doesn't fit as nicely into those two categories either, but it is a type of misinformation. So again, disinformation is deliberately false, and it's intended to create harm with either a person or a group or a country. Whereas malinformation is information that's based on reality, that which is really real, and it's used to inflict harm on that same set of folks, right? Individuals, groups, states, countries. So malinformation is more something like a rumor or an insult based upon a person's appearance or an action that they took. That's malinformation. One more time. It is what it is. We're all on the same page now, right? This is definitely Redpop. It's Redpop. Okay. So how are you going to use any of this to your advantage in your campaign? This is where things get a little interesting. So I want to read a couple of quotes to you that I think are particularly relevant. If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. And a people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It is deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and judge. And with such a people, you can do what you please. That's by Hannah Arendt. And then the truth is always something that is told, not something that is known. If there is no speaking and no writing, there would be no truth about anything. There would only be what is. And I find that a very interesting quote. That's by Susan Sontag from The Benefactor. So disinformation, and maybe more particularly an effective disinformation campaign, essentially uses a phenomenon that was discovered in 1977 called the illusory truth effect. And that's where a person hears an untruth repeated over and over and over and over again, so much that they simply just believe it. This is often, there's a quote, and I don't remember the exact quote, but it's often attributed to Joseph Goebbels back in Hitler's time, that basically says, you can lie to the people and it doesn't matter. That's not the quote. You can definitely look it up, and I'm sorry I don't have it written down here, but it turns out it's true, right? Like, we've studied this as a society now, and there's a lot of proven, there's evidence to this, right? This is something that really happens. But it's not even just that. It's not even just repeating something that's false over and over and over again. There's also a way that you can present things that make people want to believe it. And this is something that's called fluency. And the way you do this is, you present things in certain colors, or you present things in a certain font, or maybe both, right? And it compels our mind to attach onto it and say, like, yeah, like, this really stands out to me. So if you couple something like that with the fact that it's repeated over and over and over again, it becomes easier to comprehend for that reason. And in our mind, it just feels good, right? Like, yeah, this is what it is, of course. So our minds take that feeling as a cue that the claim is true. And I think arguably that's why you see so many pieces of disinformation in meme form these days. And that's not to say that all memes are disinformation. They're not. But memes are something that work pretty effectively, and therefore it just makes it all the more easier to spread disinformation through that medium. So if you add on to all of that, there's something else called amygdala hijacking. And that's another effective form of getting disinformation to spread, I guess what I'll call organically. So what an amygdala hijack is, it's similar to what we just talked about. It's amygdala hijack is where you cause an immediate and overwhelming emotional response. And then later on, the person will realize that their response was inappropriate given the trigger. But you got their attention, right? And they acted on it. They were very reactionary. And so if you want to be able to spread your message, whether it's truthful or not, you really want to take advantage of these emotional triggers that are just built into people, and it just makes them naturally vulnerable. The other thing that's worth noting is that it's often a misconception that disinformation is spread by bots or paid trolls, but effective disinformation campaigns involve a diverse set of agents and likely unwitting agents. Folks such as you and me, right? Like I'm not going to actively be part of a disinformation campaign, but maybe I end up spreading the message without realizing it, right? Because I reacted emotionally to something that I saw and immediately. So again, you might be an unwitting agent. You might be unaware of your role in the campaign, but nonetheless, you're amplifying and embellishing the message, which is then used to, polarize communities, to sow doubt about your opponent, or about science, or about medicine, or about the media, or really, whatever you want. So those are some of the techniques you can use. And if you have some good communicators working for you, they really know how to do these types of things. Okay. One more look. What color is this pop? I want your answers. It's red pop, right? What color is this pop? It's red pop. We're all on the same page now. Yes, it's red pop. So if you remember, I said one of the things that you're going to do is you're going to stick to your message. You're not going to flip flop. We got it out there early on that this was red pop. This is red pop. We can't change our message now. And here we are, spreading disinformation. It's not as malicious, right? Like I'm not ruining someone's reputation here, but I'm spreading a purposefully deceitful message that this is red pop. And that's what it is. We're all in agreement. Yes. I hope so. I hope you're saying that, on Slack or Discord or on YouTube, that this is definitely red pop. All right. What color is this pop? All right. I'm just kidding. All right. Next up here, electoral fraud. This is the people, process, and technologies behind all of this. So I've talked a lot about some of these big tools. We're coming up close to our time here, so unfortunately I can't dive deeply down into all of these. But what I will say is, before we get too far into this, is I read a number of pieces on this topic, right? Like this is a very intriguing thing to me. And some of the biggest places that are referenced almost everywhere are both the Heritage Foundation and the Brennan Center for Justice. And I got to be honest with you, I honestly preferred the Brennan Center for Justice for their materials because the way that they shared it, they talked about the information, they shared their knowledge in general. There was not a partisan bent to it. They provided the details of the research. These are the people we talked to. This is the information we looked at. They included footnotes. The Heritage Foundation, on the other hand, they're definitely a right-wing think tank, but they're one of the most prolific talkers on this topic. And their information was good, but I wouldn't say it was as great. And the reason why that is because it was polarizing. There's a lot of like liberals, ew, throughout their messaging. It's not quite to that extent, right? But they call out Democrats say and liberals say this, whereas the Brennan Center for Justice just says like, hey, this is a thing, and these are claims that we're hearing from people. The other thing that I had a problem with the Heritage Foundation was they didn't really back up what they presented, right? So they've got a number of reports, and I had I wanted to be able to say like, okay, is this really real? So what I had to do is I had to take quotes that they referenced, and they didn't link to, and I had to go search for that quote, or I took the quote with a given context. There was a quote from one of the Supreme Court justices. Actually, they didn't even name the specific justice. They just said the Supreme Court said, quote, and I don't remember what the line was, but I said, Supreme Court, comma, and I put that quote in, and I found the actual case, and the dissent or whatever it was that had that material in there. So they didn't really make it easy to back up. They didn't show me the legwork, which I appreciated that the Brennan Center did. So a lot of what I relied on here was from the Brennan Center. But they both talk about the same things, both Brennan Center and Heritage Foundation. And of course, there are a number of other places too to find this information. Those aren't the only two, but I would say in a a meta-analysis, this is what we're going through for all this. All right, so what is voter fraud? Coming up on 45 minutes here, I'm sorry. So voter fraud is literally fraud by voters. More precisely, it's an act where a voter or voters who are ineligible to vote actually go and vote in an attempt to defraud the electoral system. Sounds easy, right? Well, it's often conflated with other forms of election misconduct or other irregularities, whether intentional or not. Fraud is an intentionally high bar to pass. because we're all human and we all make mistakes, right? Like we're not all out to commit fraud. And I'm not a lawyer, so I couldn't spell out for you all of the requirements necessary to bring forth an electoral fraud case. But I've read enough recently and seen enough failure in court recently to know and understand that it isn't easy to prove fraud, right? So that means it's probably not necessarily as easy to commit either, because fraud is fraud, right? Like prosecutors, lawyers, judges, they know it when they see it because the case has to be strongly made. And there are lots and lots and lots and lots of eyes in an election, and in a presidential election for certain, right? Especially one as contentious as the previous two elections, this one this year and the one 4 years ago. So I say this next piece here, something to keep in mind. People are social creatures, because in lieu of failures in the courts of proving voter fraud, some politicians have been tossing around conspiracies that others are conspiring or even colluding together to quote, rig the election, right? Like I said, people are social creatures, right? We all like to talk. And maybe it's only with a couple of people. Maybe you only talk to just two people, right? But if you were someone who had this malicious intent and you committed fraud and you converse with these two people, well, that means you really trust these two people. And it's likely you're going to share something with these two people about what you did. You might not give full details, or maybe you will, because maybe you're really proud of yourself that you got away with it. But those two people also have their own group of folks that they talk to. It's not just you. And so they're probably going to tell, like, hey, guess what I heard from Brian the other night? He told me, he did X, Y, Z, right? So conspiracies and conspiracy thinking, again, that's a whole other presentation. So I'll just end my note by saying this. There are some academic types who spent some time researching how many people would need to be involved in any supposed cover-up of the moon landing, right? Was the moon landing faked? And so they determined that the number of people that would need to be involved, that would have to stay silent for all of these years. My light just flickered. The number of people that would have to stay silent for all these years was 440,000 people. Can you imagine 440,000 people staying silent for that long? That's wives, brothers, sisters, friends, children. People are going to be sharing this around, and the information is going to get out. The fact that you're not hearing any of this is not the sign of a massive cover-up. It's a sign that, what really happened is what really happened. We landed on the moon, right? Okay. So let's go through this as quickly as you can. Double voting, right? So this is where you vote more than once, right? You vote twice, maybe you vote 3 times. We definitely don't have time for a story I'd like to share here, but there are some folks that are so worried about this that they actually drive between polling stations and write down license plates. Crazy. Double voting. That's a concern. Doesn't really happen. People aren't that excited to vote more than once. Dead voters. This is where supposedly people who are dead have voted. It turns out more often than not, way more often than not, this is simply people who were elderly or dying. They sent in an absentee ballot and they died before election day. But the vote counted, or maybe it didn't, depending on how things worked out. Fraudulent addresses. This is where, maybe you're concerned about people who have registered, vacant lots as an address in order to double vote, or they registered an abandoned house or something like that. Felony convictions. So this is where people who were felons or ex-felons are voting and they're not supposed to. Again, more often than not, they're not likely to, because they know the law and they know that if they vote, that's breaking in their state. Let's say that that's illegal in their state for them to vote. They know if they do vote, they're breaking the law, and guess what? They're going to go back to jail, right? So this is something that's very unlikely to happen. The cases where it has happened have been so small, but they have been situations where either the person who is an ex-felon they were unaware that they couldn't vote. They didn't have that malintent, but they did vote, and it was caught. Non-citizens. Again, here's another one that I think would just be so obvious as something that doesn't happen. Non-citizens aren't here legally necessarily. Even if they are, they're here for specific purposes and for a specific period of time. And so, our electoral boards, they go through voter rolls and they can see, like, hey, this person isn't on our roll. Like, this vote doesn't count, right? And let's look into this. Oh, this person is here illegally. Guess what? We're going to deport you, right? Even if you're here legally, guess what? You did the thing you're not supposed to do. Your passport is like, we're taking it, and you got to go back to your country. Registration. So there's a few forms of this, and really the two biggest ones are where people inadvertently put down, we'll call it misinformation on their registration form. Maybe they write a 3 instead of an 8, or something like that, or they forgot to put street, or they put drive instead of street, or something like that. The other form of registration fraud is, and it's not really fraud, right? Is where there's mass registrations that happen, and the people who are doing the mass registrations take down misinformation, right? So maybe you're one of these people who's doing a mass registration. You're coming to me saying like, hey, are you registered to vote? And I'm like, no, I'm not. And then I tell you, my name's Donald Duck and I live on the moon, and you write all that down, because why would you not believe me? Of course, if I said the moon, you would believe that, but you know what I'm saying, right? I exaggerate or I lie about my information. Now, there's not really a chance usually for those people who do this to go back and verify the information. And so when these things wind up in court, it turns out, oh, that's the case. Like, yeah, I remember talking to this person. They said their name was this. I thought it was strange, but I'm not going to question them, so I wrote it down. Dogs, similar to falsifying your registration, or the claims of falsified registration. There have been a handful of folks who have registered their dogs. There is one case where a person actually had their dog literally vote, and they put their dog's paw print on the signature line. But of course, they also wrote void on the ballot. They thought that was something that would be cute for them and their family, or the dog. I don't know. But these are all things. So these are all examples of fraud that could be perpetrated by us, the voters. And they just don't really happen. There's so much written about all this stuff, and there's just so little of it. Some of the things that are maybe more likely to happen are things such as vote buying. And this is where you are the politician and you go to people, likely a large number of people, whether all at once or not, and you basically bribe them into voting for you through some fashion. Maybe you're going to give them access to you, or maybe you're going to give them vouchers for something. But this is where you as a candidate are perpetrating fraud. This is definitely something that can happen and does happen, and it's typically caught pretty easily because people come forth and they say like, hey, this person came to me and they said, vote for me in exchange for this, right? So this is something that is caught, and it's something that the candidate does, or the campaign does. Election officials, again, this is anyone involved in the process of the election coming in and saying, hey, I'm going to change all these votes, right? This gets caught rather easily because, at least in this election, I believe it's 95% of the country has a paper trail, right? So if there's mass discrepancies between, thousands of votes saying Joe Biden won or Donald Trump won, we can easily go back to the paper and see what it is, right? And you as the voter were given that piece of paper. Either you filled it out yourself, or you're given the printout from when you did it electronically, and you can verify, this has my vote correctly, right? So when you go to tabulate things, it should all add up, right? And the last thing is machine hacking. At DEF CON, of course, they have the election hacking village, and I believe this last year, and not the virtual one, but the previous one when they met in person, I believe they had 40 different voting machines, and all of them were hacked. But the thing that you need to keep in mind about this is they all involve some level of obvious deception, or like it's a really involved thing that needs to happen. Chances are great if you could get away with it, you might be able to impact a small handful of votes on that one machine. I guess depending on your district, it could be as many as thousands. But chances are, it's going to be obvious if you're using a voting machine and you are at your polling station and you lift it up and you get a USB drive out of your thing, and it's going to be pretty obvious even to the non-technical people working there, volunteering their time, that something's up. There's also, of course, the tabulators and things like that where you can get in and mess around with. But again, we've got a paper trail. We can go and we can match these things up. So we've been doing elections for a very long period of time, over 200 years now. We've got this down pretty well. The occurrence of electoral fraud is very low. The risk is pretty great, and the payout really is not worth it. It does happen. It does happen, but it's just not something that's worth most people's time. So, with that said, can you steal an election? I guess I would say it depends on the level of office you're running for. I don't think you can steal a presidential election, but you might be able to steal a local election. I do, however, think that you can bend an election to your will, and you have hopes that you wind up winning. With all that said, thanks. This is regular pop, by the way. This is just Coke. I guess you could say it's brown. Email me, Brian@BiotSec. Find me on Twitter, bmart517. It sounds like Kyle's on here. I don't know if there's any questions. We might have time for a few, but I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I'm looking for any questions that people may have right now.
All right.
We've had a lot of conversation and a lot of people guessing different colors between Discord and our YouTube channel.
Very good. Do we have lots of purples? Lots of people saying purple?
Oh yeah, I was a purple fan. I was a purple fan.
But we all know it's red, right? It's definitely red.
Yeah, it's definitely red.
Okay.
I don't see any questions, sir, so I think we are good to go.
Very good. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to talk more about this stuff, I'd be happy to have a conversation. Please reach out. There's so much more we can talk about, and maybe at some time in the future, I'll do another presentation on electoral related stuff. Thank you, and happy holidays.
Well, thanks again, Brian.
Yep.
And see you guys later.